Imagine a military empire so confident, so obsessed with glory, that it never believed it could lose. And imagine another nation, quiet, cold, calculating, waiting patiently for the moment to strike. This is the story of how Russia dismantled Japan's million-man force in just 11 days. A collapse so shocking that historians still struggle to understand how an army this large vanished this fast. Summer 1945, Japan still had one card left. While Tokyo burned from American firebombing and the island defenses fell one by one, Japan believed its strongest shield was far away, deep inside Manchuria. A force so huge that no one imagined it could ever be destroyed. The Kwantung Army, the pride of the Japanese Empire. 1,000 men trained, armed, and spread across a vast defensive network. They were the unbreakable wall, or at least, that's what Tokyo told the world. But while Japan bragged, Russia planned. In the shadows of Siberia, the Soviet Union spent months preparing something no empire had ever attempted. A campaign that would combine tanks, infantry, airborne troops, and artillery, all moving across mountains, deserts, and forests at once. It would be the largest land offensive of the entire Second World War. The Japanese didn't know it yet, but their so-called million-man shield was already doomed. For years, Japan and the Soviet Union had a neutrality pact. Tokyo trusted it, believed in it, relied on it. But Joseph Stalin, he simply waited for timing. And in 1945, the timing was perfect. Germany had fallen. The Red Army was now the most experienced fighting force on the planet, and the Allies were pressuring Stalin to crush Japan from the north. Japan had humiliated Russia in 1905 at Port Arthur and Tsushima. Stalin didn't forget. He never forgot. And now, the chance had come to settle that score. In secret, he transported more than 1.5 million Soviet troops, 5,500 tanks, 26,000 artillery pieces, and thousands of aircraft across Siberia. The most difficult military movement in modern history. All of it unseen, all of it quiet. All of it aimed at one target, Japan's supposedly invincible fortress in Manchuria. August 8, 1945. Japanese officers sat in command posts, sipping tea, reading reports, and insisting that the Soviets wouldn't attack. Their maps showed the Manchurian terrain. Mountain ranges, deserts, rivers, and narrow passes. Impossible terrain for tanks, they said. No army can cross this. But what they didn't know was that the Red Army had already crossed. Thousands of Soviet tanks were crawling across the deserts at night, headlights covered, engines muffled. Infantry divisions were already moving through mountain passes Japan thought were impassable. Airborne units waited for the signal to drop deep behind Japanese lines. Japan believed they were safe. But the truth? They were surrounded, and they didn't even know it. At exactly midnight, Soviet commanders received a single coded message. Start, and the world changed. Artillery roared across the night sky. Soviet rockets screamed like thunder. The ground shook under the weight of tank columns longer than entire cities. The Kwantung Army, once the symbol of Imperial Japan's might, was caught completely unprepared. No defensive line was ready. No units were mobilized. Communication collapsed almost instantly. And within just 6 hours, the Japanese High Command realized something unthinkable. The Red Army wasn't attacking one line. It was attacking every line, from every direction, all at the same time. This wasn't a battle, it was a storm swallowing 1 million soldiers, before they even knew a war had begun. When the first Soviet shells crashed into Japanese positions, most officers still believed it was a mistake, or a border incident, or maybe even training fire. They didn't understand. What hit them wasn't a skirmish. It wasn't a probing attack. It was a triple spearhead invasion. one of the fastest and most complex offensives ever launched in human history. The Soviets didn't come from one direction. They came from three. The Trans-Baikal Front under Marshal Vasilevsky swept in from the west, crossing the Gobi Desert with a tank force the Japanese never thought possible. The First Far Eastern Front attacked from the north, smashing through mountains Japan believed were natural walls. The Second Far Eastern Front surged from the east toward the heart of Manchuria. Within hours, the Kwantung Army had lost the thing it depended on most. And once they lost time, everything else collapsed. Japan had bragged for years about its fortified Manchurian defenses. The reality? Most fortifications existed only on paper. The best soldiers had already been transferred to defend the home islands. Supplies were short, artillery was outdated. Tanks were so old that some dated back to the early 1930s. Many Kwantung soldiers were teenagers, barely trained. Some were elderly reservists. Many had rifles, but almost no ammunition. And yet they were told, "Fight to the last, Manchuria cannot fall." But the army that once terrified China was now a shadow. Underfed, undertrained, and completely unprepared for modern, mechanized warfare. They were facing the most battle-hardened army on Earth, with equipment that belonged in a museum. In the West, Soviet tanks crossed the supposedly impassable Gobi Desert in just 48 hours. Japanese commanders had insisted, "No modern army can move armor through that terrain." But Soviet engineers had studied it for months. They prepared fuel depots, medical stations, water trucks, and supply lines, stretching for hundreds of kilometers. So when their tanks appeared on the horizon, the Japanese panicked. These tanks weren't supposed to exist in this desert. They weren't supposed to appear behind Japanese lines. They weren't supposed to move this fast. Entire Japanese divisions found themselves encircled before they even knew where the main battle was happening. This was not a defeat. This was a military nightmare. August 10th, before sunrise, Soviet aircraft filled the sky over Manchuria. Bombers pounded communication centers. Fighter planes strafed retreating columns. Transport aircraft dropped paratroopers miles behind the front. The Kwantung Army depended heavily on telegraph lines. But by midday, almost every line had been cut. The Japanese command was blind, deaf, disconnected. Units fought alone, without orders, without directions, without hope. Some divisions still believed they were facing a small Soviet force, until an entire mechanized corps smashed into them like a steel tsunami. Others tried to form defensive lines, only to learn that Soviet tanks had already bypassed them, racing deeper into Manchuria. The Japanese map of the battlefield disintegrated within hours. Nothing made sense anymore, and the army that once boasted of its honor was now fighting for survival. Japan had built its empire on the belief that spirit, discipline, and sacrifice could defeat any enemy. But the Red Army wasn't fighting with spirit. It was fighting with logistics, speed, precision, and overwhelming firepower. Where Japan had horses, the Soviets had thousands of tanks. Where Japan had outdated guns, the Soviets had rocket artillery. Where Japan had patches of fortified bunkers, the Soviets had mobile infantry storms that moved like lightning. It didn't matter how brave the Japanese soldiers were. It didn't matter how loyal they were to the emperor. They were being crushed by a machine of war, built to break empires. By the end of day 3, something happened that sealed the Kwantung Army's fate. The Japanese High Command abandoned its headquarters. Soviet breakthroughs made the location too dangerous. Generals fled south, staff officers scattered. Files were burned or left behind. The army was now headless. Units still loyal to their commanders waited for orders that would never come. Some held their positions until they were wiped out. Others attempted suicidal charges against Soviet tanks. The collapse wasn't just physical, it was psychological. An army's strength lies not in numbers, but in its ability to think. And by day 4, the Kwantung Army had lost the ability to think. It was only a matter of time before it lost everything else. By the morning of August 12th, the Kwantung Army no longer resembled a fighting force. It was a broken mosaic, scattered fragments of divisions, companies, and platoons, each fighting its own private war. Some tried to regroup, some tried to flee. Some simply dug shallow holes in the earth and waited for the end. And through it all, the Soviet advance did not slow. Not for darkness, not for rain, not for enemy resistance. The Red Army moved like a machine with a single command: break the empire's backbone. The main retreat route toward Mukden became a horror scene. Columns of Japanese soldiers, some barefoot, some wounded, some starving, marched without formation, without officers, without direction. Many carried rifles with no ammunition. Others carried nothing at all. Villagers along the road watched silently as the men once hailed as conquerors shuffled past like ghosts. Behind them, Soviet artillery thundered. Ahead of them, Soviet tanks were closing in. The retreating soldiers had no maps, no supplies, no communication. All they had was fear, and fear was winning. One Japanese officer tried to turn the tide. General Otozo Yamada, commander of the Kwantung Army. He knew the truth his government refused to admit. Manchuria was lost. Japan had no chance. Still, he attempted to reorganize the shattered units. He delivered speeches to teenage soldiers trembling behind ruined fortifications. He sent couriers with desperate orders, hoping at least some messages would get through. But Japan had sent him to fight a modern mechanized army with equipment older than he was. One of his officers wrote, "General Yamada stood in the ruins of our headquarters. He looked at the maps, then at us, and said, 'Gentlemen, the Empire did not prepare us for this.'" It was the closest any Japanese commander came to admitting total defeat. Japan believed its strategy of hiding snipers in trees and machine gun nests among the hills would slow the Soviets. It didn't. Soviet reconnaissance planes identified almost every Japanese stronghold before the infantry even arrived. Artillery wiped out positions in minutes. Tanks crushed through trenches and bunkers as if they were made of paper. By noon, the Japanese defensive lines south of Mutanchiang completely dissolved. One survivor recalled, "We were firing blindly into smoke. Then suddenly the smoke moved, and we realized it was a Soviet tank coming straight at us. His entire platoon was wiped out. He lived only because he fainted before the shell exploded." While the Kwantung Army crumbled, millions of civilians, Chinese, Korean, Manchu, and Japanese, were trapped in the chaos. Railroads collapsed under bombing. Refugee convoys stretched for miles. Entire families hid in cornfields as Soviet units swept past. Japanese settlers begged the Kwantung Army for protection, but the army itself needed saving. One settler wrote in her diary, "We had believed the Kwantung Army would protect us, but when they passed our village, they had no weapons. They were crying. The empire that once preached strength was now running." On August 13, Soviet paratroopers landed near key rail hubs and airfields deep inside Manchuria. For the Japanese, it was an impossible sight. Enemy soldiers behind them. This single strike shattered whatever hope remained. Entire battalions surrendered without firing. Others fought in confusion, believing they were surrounded by armies that did not exist. One Japanese colonel wrote, "We expected the Soviets to attack our borders. We did not expect them to appear in our lungs and spine." The Kwantung Army wasn't being defeated. It was being disassembled. By day 6, the Soviets reached the Sungari River. The last intact bridge became the final escape route for thousands of Japanese soldiers. The scene was chaos. Men throwing away rifles to run faster officers, screaming orders no one obeyed. Horses collapsing under exhaustion, wounded soldiers carried on doors, ripped from villages. Soviet artillery zeroed in. Shells exploded across the bridge. Bodies fell into the river and vanished. One Japanese lieutenant watched helplessly and whispered, "So, this is how an army dies." Not with a final stand, but with a stampede. On August 14th, headquarters sent out a single, chilling message. All units stand by, do not counterattack. Await further notice from the Emperor. Officers stared at the telegram in disbelief. What further notice could possibly matter? The army was disintegrating. Their soldiers were starving. Their ammunition was gone. But the truth was unfolding thousands of miles away. The Emperor of Japan was preparing to speak words no Japanese soldier had ever imagined hearing. Surrender. And when those words reached Manchuria, the last fragments of the Kwantung Army would face the final unbearable question. How do you surrender an army that no longer exists? On the morning of August 15, 1945, every surviving Japanese unit in Manchuria received the same unbelievable transmission. The Emperor will speak at noon. Soldiers who had not eaten in days straightened their uniforms. Officers stood frozen beside shattered radios, and across the ruined plains, an impossible silence spread. For the first time in the 2,600-year history of the Japanese Empire, its emperor would speak directly to his people. When noon arrived, the battered radios crackled, and then a soft, trembling voice. A voice every Japanese soldier recognized instantly. We have resolved to pave the way for a great peace, by enduring the unendurable and suffering what is unsufferable. The word was never said aloud, but every man understood it. Japan had surrendered. The undefeated Kwantung Army, once called the Sword of the Empire, had outlived the empire itself. For the first time in 11 days, the thunder of artillery faded. Machine guns fell silent. Tanks cooled in place. Soviet soldiers raised their rifles skyward in victory. Japanese troops lowered theirs in disbelief. Some wept, some bowed to the earth. Some stared into nothingness, and many refused to accept it at all. One officer tore the insignia off his uniform and shouted, "This is not defeat! This is betrayal!" He was right about one thing. It wasn't the Kwantung Army that had fallen. It was Tokyo that had abandoned them. Even after the emperor's broadcast, chaos ruled Manchuria. Some Japanese commanders ordered immediate surrender. Others insisted the broadcast was fake. A few demanded their soldiers fight to the last man. The problem was no longer willpower, it was reality. Most Japanese units had no ammunition left. Many had no food. Thousands had no officers. They couldn't fight, even if they wanted to. By that evening, Soviet units were accepting surrender en masse. Columns of starving, barefoot Japanese soldiers marching with hands raised. Entire regiments stepping out of the forest, uniforms in tatters. Groups of medics pushing the wounded in wheelbarrows. The once mighty Kwantung Army looked like refugees. For the Soviets, the mission wasn't just to defeat Japan. It was to secure Manchuria and capture as many Japanese troops as possible. They succeeded. More than 600,000 Japanese soldiers were marched into captivity. Most would never see home again. The march north became a death sentence. Officers collapsing from exhaustion, teenage conscripts crying for water, frost-bitten soldiers dragged by comrades, men so hungry they chewed on grass. One Soviet guard wrote in his diary, "These soldiers were once feared across Asia. Now they are shadows." General Yamada, commander of the Kwantung Army, issued his final order. Cease resistance. Preserve life. The war is over. He signed the surrender papers on August 19th, his hands shaking. When asked for his final statement, he said, "Japan sent me an army of ghosts. I only watched them disappear." His words became the obituary of the Kwantung Army. Tokyo never wanted the Japanese public to know what truly happened in Manchuria, so they buried the truth. The starvation, the lack of weapons the 15-year-old boys forced to fight, trained Soviet tank brigades the civilians abandoned without warning the officers who never received reinforcements, the army destroyed in 11 days by a modern military superpower. The Kwantung Army became a legend. but a legend no one talked about. It was easier to remember the samurai myths than the reality of an army sacrificed by its own nation. In 1946 and 1947, the first survivors finally returned to Japan. Families gathered at ports, waiting for their sons. Most waited in vain. The men who stepped off the ships were emaciated, silent, and hollow-eyed. Many carried nothing except a piece of paper with a prisoner number. Others carried nothing at all. One mother said, "When my son finally returned, he looked at me but did not speak. He was there, and yet he was not." Manchuria had taken something from them that could never be restored. Historians call it the August Storm. Soviet generals call it the perfect offensive. But for the Japanese soldiers who lived it, it was the collapse of their world. In just 11 days, an army of nearly 1 million men, an army once feared across Asia, was destroyed so completely that it left no heroic last stand, no glorious final battle, no victory songs or legends. Only silence, only footprints in the dust, only the memory of an army that died not because it was weak, but because it was forgotten.